The public inquiry into the mishandling of Stephen Lawrence's murder just days away. The Metropolitan Police are getting ready for a hammering over their original refusal to accept that the murder was a racist crime and for their failures during the investigation. One group of police likely to emerge with credit, however, are the Kent officers who conducted an investigation into the Met's handling of the case. Tonight, they talk for the first time to Newsnight. Robin Denslow reports.
It's nearly 6 years since Stephen Lawrence was murdered by a gang of white youths in this nondescript avenue in the suburbs of southeast London. Today there are a bunch of faded red roses on the spot where he fell as the quite extraordinary repercussions of his death continued. The report of the Lawrence inquiry is expected in about 10 days and could recommend radical change in the policing of racist crime. And the Metropolitan Police have a new high-profile team reinvestigating the killing.
Hello, sir. Hello, James.
But in all this, one key group have until now made no public comment. The Kent police team were asked by the Police Complaints Authority to investigate the Metropolitan Police's handling of the case after complaints by the Lawrence family. Their confidential report, highly critical of the blunders made by the Met and of the Met's own discredited review of their performance, provided much of the ammunition for the Lawrence inquiry. In their first interview, the Kent team discussed their findings of what happened on the night of the murder and the failure of the Met's initial investigation.
This was the efforts of a B team. They were a team cobbled together for this inquiry, and it was not the best that the Metropolitan Police could have provided. There were failings that should never have happened. Their ability to progress the inquiry in the way that it could be most efficiently run was seriously flawed.
Stephen Lawrence was murdered in an unprovoked racist attack on the 22nd of April 1993 as he waited for a bus with his friend Dwayne Brooks. There were witnesses that night who saw the white gang involved and knew of earlier attacks they'd carried out. And some came forward after this televised appeal the following night.
This is a dreadful crime, a completely unprovoked attack on a young 18-year-old black youth.
Soon after this appeal, and just 20 hours after the murder, the most important informant, now known as James Grant, came forward to Eltham Police Station. He was seen by no one more important than a detective sergeant, and his information was mysteriously dismissed. If police had questioned James Grant, they would have learned some crucial information. On the night of the murder, he came to this house, just a few hundred yards from the murder site, now under new ownership. Here he met a friend, witness Kay. He'd just been to the murder site and had then gone on to the house of two of the suspects, Neil and James Acorn.
Witness Kay had said that after he visited the scene where Stephen had been murdered, he went to the Acorn's house where he informed them that a young black boy had been murdered in Wellhall Road. He saw the two Acorn brothers in a state of undress, and they had been washing themselves and perhaps articles, and that when they learnt that the person had been killed, they reacted quite significantly. They were surprised and they appear to be quite disturbed that the young man was dead.
So the implication then is that witness Kay seemed to think that the Acorns had carried out the murder?
When he went to the Wellhall Road, when he discovered that a young black boy had been stabbed, immediately in his mind he went to the Acorns' house as he felt that they may have had something to do with it. That's quite clear.
Well, after seeing what they were doing in the house, he was even more convinced?
And he shared that suspicion with others later that night, one of whom was James Grant.
What's happened to witness Kay since?
Well, witness Kay was interviewed by the Metropolitan Police in 1993. He did say some of that to the Metropolitan Police and did make a very short statement, but he has never given evidence in any criminal proceedings, and of course was not called to give evidence before the public inquiry.
We understand he's still terrified of the Acorns.
I suspect he is.
Other information was coming in. On Friday, the night after the murder, a 12-year-old found an anonymous note naming the alleged attackers in this phone box. It was handed to police next day. And on the Saturday, an anonymous male, the letter writer, rang police to say there was another note in this pub car park just down the road. As police were searching, another letter was secretly placed on the windscreen of one of their cars. The mystery letter named 4 suspects, describing 2 of them, Neil Acorn and David Norris, as very dangerous knife users who always carry knives and quite like using them. It linked them to an earlier stabbing in the area. As well as all this, there was further information coming in from anonymous phone calls.
In particular, there was a young lady who rang twice on the evening of Friday, gave very important information about who she suspected was responsible for the stabbing, and then later, the next day, Saturday, she rang a 3rd time and again gave information which could only have come from someone very close to those responsible for the murder. That person needed to be identified as soon as possible.
And what did the team do about it?
Very little. We can find very little evidence that they did anything at all to identify that caller.
Looking back at all this, if you'd been in charge of the investigation then, when would you have made arrests?
I certainly would have been making arrests either late Sunday evening or early Monday morning. Those are sorts of timescales we're talking about.
But no arrests were made for over 2 weeks.
Yes, and indeed, no new information. There was nothing different between the time span that we are talking about, the first weekend, than when the arrests were actually made on the 7th of May. No additional information was available to the inquiry team.
But if the police want to re-question the key witnesses, they could find it difficult. Some are naturally terrified while the killers are still at large, and we're told that one has already been threatened with having his throat cut if he talks. And then there's suspicion of the police themselves, who are accused of breaking trust. It's claimed that confidential information passed on to the police has reached the local community and even the suspects themselves. So what have the Kent team to say of the suspects, the 5 youths who've been described as such throughout the Lawrence inquiry and elsewhere publicly named as the murderers? The Kent team, like the new Met team, aim to challenge all previous assumptions about the case, including the role played that night by one of the suspects, Gary Dobson.
Was Gary Dobson present when Stephen Lawrence was murdered? Because we are aware that Gary Dobson has 4 adult alibis who are prepared to say that Gary Dobson was elsewhere when Stephen was murdered.
But Gary Dobson was at the Acorns' house later that night.
Yes, and he admits that. He admits that after Stephen was murdered, he did go to the Acorns' house and he did see them. And indeed, he said that under interview to the police in 1993. So he's at no time has Gary Dobson tried to pretend that he did not go to the Acorns' house. And indeed, we know that witness K actually saw him at the house shortly before midnight.
So do you see the other 4 then as being more likely suspects, there being a split between them and Gary Dobson?
Yes, I think there is. I think if you look at the behaviour of Gary Dobson throughout all police investigations and indeed throughout the public inquiry, I think he's in a different category to the other 4.
And there are further questions to be asked about the suspects who were secretly filmed making racist remarks and playing with knives on this notorious police surveillance video. Were others involved in the attack? After all, 2 witnesses talked of a fair-haired or blonde attacker. David Clapperton carried out much of the day-to-day investigation for Kent.
Well, I think it's very significant. The main witness in this case, Dwayne Brooks, has consistently described the person who stabbed Stephen as having fair to blonde hair. So what the police inquiry needs to do is establish which of the prime suspects had fair hair on the night of the 22nd of April 1993, and if none of them had fair hair, is there an unknown suspect, offender, out there that's never been spoken to by the police?
So if there was an extra person there with blonde or fair hair, would he have been a central member of that gang?
Well, there's been a lot of information and speculation that if you wanted to join the A-Court gang, you had to stab someone. And indeed, if you look back just prior to Stephen's murder, we have examples of Stacey Benefield being stabbed, probably by David Norris, and we have examples of other people being stabbed by the A-Court brothers. So if somebody wanted to join the A-Court gang, they had to stab somebody. Maybe, just maybe, this was a new member of the gang that needed to show their worth by stabbing Stephen.
Robin Denslow reporting. Today was, of course,